Everyone said this German Shepherd was too far gone aggressive, dangerous, beyond saving. Shelter staff labeled him a threat. His days were numbered. But then, a silent veteran walked out of the mountains. He didn't bring tools. He didn't bring commands. He just brought a stool, a book, and a broken heart. What happened next shocked everyone and changed both of their lives forever. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The silence inside Mason Whitaker's cabin wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a companion, tangible, heavy, the kind that settled in your bones after years of living alone with ghosts. It had been nearly 16 years since Mason climbed into the Sierra Madres and never looked back. A man in his early 50s now, lean like a weathered fence post and just as stubborn. His face was a map of time-lined, bearded, and bronzed by sun and solitude. His gray-streaked hair curled slightly past his collar, and his eyes, when they dared to meet anyone's, held the weary knowledge of a man who had seen too much and spoken too little. This morning, like every quarter year, was one of the rare times he left his mountain. Supplies were low flour, salt, coffee, diesel for the truck, the essentials. Luxuries were distractions, and Mason had abandoned distractions long ago. As the rusty engine of his old Ford growled to life, he took one last look out the cabin's window. The valley below stretched quiet and golden. Mason wasn't chasing anything he hadn't for years, but this time, something was waiting for him down there. Something that would change everything. Mason's truck rumbled down the twisting mountain road, tires crunching over gravel and pine needles. The descent from solitude to society always felt like betrayal. He wasn't going to town to connect. He was going for coffee and kerosene. That was it. The town of Pine Hollow didn't change much over the years, a place tourists loved for its rustic charm. But locals like Mason knew it for what it was: quiet, judgmental, and endlessly curious about the man from the hills who never said much and never stayed long. He kept his visits surgical, in and out, early morning, off-season, no chit-chat, just a stop at the feed and supply store, grab what he needed, and disappear again into the trees. But that morning, something changed. He was passing the county shelter, a flat gray building squatting beside a dirt lot, when the sound hit him like a punch to the gut. It wasn't a bark, not the kind Mason had known in his old life, the rhythmic, purposeful barks of trained dogs doing their job. No. This was panic. Pure, primal, unfiltered terror laced with fury. It came in desperate bursts, broken by the gut-wrenching slam of a body hurling itself against metal. Then came the scream. Not the dog's a man's. Mason's hands, calloused and steady, gripped the wheel. He should have kept driving. This wasn't his world anymore. He had built walls around himself higher than any kennel fence, but something deep inside, old muscle memory or something heavier, tugged at him. He pulled to the shoulder 50 yards from the gate. Two men stood in the gravel lot, framed by the wire fence and an animal transport truck. One, bleeding from the forearm, staggered backward with curses. The other, older and calmer, tried to intervene. The injured man, an animal control officer named Paul, was furious, shouting about rabies and putting the damn thing down before it hurt anyone else. Mason followed their gaze. Inside the transport kennel, a large German Shepherd exploded into another frenzy. Gray and white, mottled like storm clouds. The dog hurled itself at the cage door, snarling with such intensity it seemed to shake the bolts loose. But Mason saw what the others didn't. He saw the tremors, the way the dog's ears were pinned flat, not forward, the whites of his eyes, the foam around his muzzle, not from aggression, but from hyperventilation. And more than anything, Mason saw the head tilt skyward. The shepherd wasn't focused on the men. It wasn't attacking. It was scanning the horizon. Looking up, looking for danger, the way a soldier does. A memory slammed into Mason with the force of a mortar blast. 2006. Basra, a dusty road. His canine partner, Diesel, sleek, black, alert, had stopped mid-scan, ears flat, eyes skyward. Mason had followed his gaze just in time to see the rocket-propelled grenade incoming. It had taken Diesel's life, left Mason shattered. Now here, on this cracked dirt lot in a place he hadn't meant to stop, was another shepherd doing the same damn thing. "Don't," he muttered to himself. "This isn't yours. You don't know this dog." But the shaking in his chest wasn't fear, it was recognition. The younger man, Paul, reached for a control pole. "We're putting it down, now," he barked, blood dripping from his arm. "Wait," Mason said, his voice rusty and rough from disuse. The word froze the air. Even the dog paused. The older shelter director, Tom, turned slowly. Everyone in Pine Hollow knew of Mason, the reclusive man who bought in bulk and never spoke. But Tom had never heard him utter a word. Until now. Mason stepped forward. The shepherd went wild again, slamming into the bars. But Mason didn't flinch. He stood 10 feet away, his posture calm, angled slightly to the side, a non-threatening stance burned into his muscle memory from years ago. Tom narrowed his eyes. "You know dogs." "I used to," Mason said simply. Paul scoffed. "That thing's a rabid monster." Mason didn't look at him. He looked at the bleeding paws, the panic in the shepherd's eyes, the scream behind the bark. "He's not vicious," Mason said, soft but certain. "He's terrified." Tom hesitated. His instinct said this man wasn't some starry-eyed volunteer with fantasies of rescue. There was something in the way Mason stood grounded. Still, not afraid. A presence. "You a handler?" Mason nodded once, retired. That one word shifted the entire scene. Tom lowered the catchpole. Paul opened his mouth to protest, but Tom cut him off. "Go get stitched up. Now. That's an order." Paul stormed away, cursing under his breath. Tom turned back. "I can't let you in the kennel. It's a liability." "I don't need to go in," Mason said. "Just give me a stool. And space." Tom raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Inside the office, a young tech named Zoe watched through the blinds. Her breath caught. She'd seen dogs like this before, but she had never seen a man like that. 10 minutes later, Mason sat in the gravel, a battered 3-legged stool beneath him, 10 feet from the cage. He opened a weathered paperback book, held it in his lap, but he didn't read. He just sat, still, breathing, waiting, and the wild shepherd. He lunged, he barked, he threatened, and Mason didn't move an inch. Not away, not forward. He was just there. For the first time in days, the dog wasn't met with poles, yelling, or pain. Just the scent of calm. And something else. Recognition. A soldier had found another. For nearly an hour, Mason didn't move. The storm of barking from the shepherd, now known only by the name, hastily scribbled on the intake form. Ghost crashed against him like waves on rock. Deep, guttural barks that thudded in his chest. Saliva sprayed. The metal bars of the transport cage clanged with each hit. But Mason stayed still. He didn't speak, didn't flinch. He turned a page in the tattered book in his lap, though his eyes never really read a word. Across the lot, Zoe stood frozen in the shelter's front office, her hand still clutching the blinds. "What is he doing?" she asked under her breath. Tom, standing beside her, narrowed his eyes. "He's not ignoring the dog," he murmured. "He's outlasting him." And just as he said it, the rhythm changed. Ghost lunged again, but it wasn't as sharp. The bark that followed was less ferocious, more confused. He let out a strange, frustrated whine, pacing in the cage like he was waiting for the next move that never came. There was no retaliation, no voice, no violence, only the smell of old leather and pine smoke, and a man who refused to leave. Ghost stopped. He stared. Mason turned another page, slow and steady. Then, the barking stopped completely. The shepherd dropped to his belly, still trembling, still alert, but watching, studying, trying to decode the strange, quiet presence that didn't act like any human he'd ever known. By the second hour, Mason slowly closed his book, slid it into the pocket of his brown leather jacket, and stood. The dog tensed not to attack, but in fear. Mason didn't approach. He didn't even glance back. He simply picked up his stool and walked to the truck. Behind him, Ghost didn't lunge. He didn't bark. He just watched, ears still flat, chest heaving. That night, Mason didn't go back to his cabin. He pulled his truck into a dark corner of the shelter's gravel lot, reclined the seat, and slept in the cab. Fitfully. The ghost of another Shepherd diesel haunted the silence between dreams. At dawn, before the sun touched the edge of the valley, Mason was back. Same stool, same distance, same tattered book. Ghost exploded again, but shorter this time. The fury burned out faster, replaced by pacing, whining, confused growling. He retreated to the far corner of the cage, his eyes never leaving the man. On day 3, Mason moved the stool closer. Only by a foot, but it was enough. Ghost barked, but then backed away, retreating instead of charging. His tail wasn't wagging, but it wasn't tucked either. His paws were raw from days of clawing metal, his chest stained with dried foam and fear. That afternoon, Zoe brought Mason a coffee. "It's cold out here," she said gently, holding out a paper cup. "You haven't moved in hours." He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." She hesitated. "I heard you, the German—" Mason raised an eyebrow. "When you whispered it to him yesterday, Sitz and Platz. I took German in high school. I know what those mean." Mason's eyes softened just slightly. He knew them too. Zoe looked back toward the kennel. "I don't think he's just a stray. There's something trained about him. Military." Mason didn't answer. He didn't have to. Zoe reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a clear plastic sleeve folded papers inside. The man who dumped him, he didn't give a damn, said the dog was broken, threw this at the counter, told us to take it or he'd shoot it. She handed it to Mason. He opened the sleeve. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble. Inside was a DoD discharge certificate, a DD Form 2209. MWD name, Ghost status, retired unit private security contractor, date of discharge, 2023. Notes, multi-purpose K9, advanced threat detection, overseas deployment history. Mason's throat went dry. Zoe lowered her voice. "David, the officer who got bit, ran the guy's plates. Turns out he has priors for animal cruelty. He beat that dog, Mason. He beat a veteran." Mason closed his eyes. It was happening again. Another working dog trained loyal, broken not by war, but by betrayal. And this time, he had a chance to do something about it. That evening, he brought something new to the stool. A foil packet, liver treats, high value, meant for K9s. He didn't toss them, he didn't bribe, he didn't even move. He just laid it gently on the ground, just inside the gate, then retreated. Ghost watched for over 2 hours, pacing, trembling, growling at shadows, but the smell was too strong, the offering too tempting. At last, he crept forward and devoured it. The next morning, Mason returned. This time, he sat only 6 feet from the cage. He laid down another packet. Ghost waited just 10 minutes. And ate. He still trembled. He still growled. But he was beginning to believe. By the end of day 4, the dog whose file labeled him as aggressive beyond saving was now lying in the cage, watching Mason with something new in his eyes. Not fear. Not rage. Something quieter. Like the first whisper of trust. By the 5th morning, something had shifted not in Ghost, but in Mason. He still came at sunrise, same stool, same book, same silence. But beneath the calm exterior, something deeper had begun to unravel. This wasn't just about saving a dog anymore. It was about confronting the man he had become. That morning, when Mason knelt to place a fresh liver packet under the gate, Ghost didn't retreat. He didn't lunge either. He just stood still, his gray and white body rigid, his eyes locked on Mason with a complex swirl of suspicion and longing. And then Mason did something that startled even himself. He whispered, "Platz." Ghost froze. The word hit like a forgotten memory, one buried deep beneath trauma. His ears twitched, his paws shuffled. He didn't obey, but he heard it. And that was something. Mason sat back on the stool, his book unopened. He just breathed. It was day 5, and Ghost wasn't the only one being unraveled by the stillness. That night, long after the shelter closed and the gravel lot returned to darkness, Mason didn't drive to his cabin. He sat on the concrete outside Ghost's kennel, a blanket around his shoulders, the cold biting at his bones. Inside the cage, Ghost had stopped barking hours ago. He wasn't sleeping, but he wasn't panicking either. They were two soldiers keeping vigil. Mason whispered into the night, "You don't know what I've done." And that's when Zoe found him. She was working late, organizing vaccine records and intake forms when she looked out the clinic window and saw the outline of a man still hunched, haunted. She walked out quietly, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "I figured you might still be here," she said, offering one to him. He took it, nodded, "Thanks." Zoe didn't sit, but she didn't leave either. She stood beside him, watching Ghost's slow, rhythmic breathing. I read his file again. She said, the dates, the locations. He was deployed, more than once. Mason didn't respond. Zoe hesitated. "You were too, weren't you?" A long silence followed. Then Kandahar, Iraq before that, Kosovo before that. "And your dog?" "Diesel, German Shepherd, smartest damn dog I ever knew, smarter than most people." Zoe looked at him gently. "What happened?" Mason's jaw clenched, his grip on the coffee tightened. "He saved my life," he said finally, voice cracking. "Saw the threat before I did, took the blast instead of me." Zoe's eyes filled with tears. "I blamed myself," he continued. "Thought maybe I gave the wrong signal. Hesitated too long. I don't know. Doesn't matter. He died. I didn't." He looked into Ghost's kennel. "And I ran, not from the war, not from the pain, from everything, from people, from remembering. I crawled up that mountain, buried myself in silence, and let the world forget me." Zoe sat beside him now, not saying anything, just listening. Mason looked at her, and for the first time in years, his voice cracked with vulnerability. "I wasn't trying to save this dog, Zoe. Not really. I was trying to save him." His gaze dropped. "But it's not Diesel in there. It's Ghost. And he doesn't need a ghost. He needs me." Zoe touched his arm. "Then let him have you." The next day, Mason brought something new. Not just liver treats, not just German commands whispered through chain link. He brought honesty. He pulled his stool closer now, just 4 feet from the gate. Ghost stiffened, hackles raised, but didn't back away. And Mason whispered again, "Sits." Ghost didn't sit, but his ears perked. Then Mason did something he hadn't done in years, not since Diesel died. He slid his hand, palm out, against the chain link gate, slowly, deliberately, no sudden moves, no command, just offering. Ghost tensed, nose twitching, eyes flickering between fear and curiosity. And then, inch by inch, he crept forward. He sniffed, paused, growled softly, then leaned forward and licked the wire. One slow, cautious swipe of the tongue across the spot where Mason's hand rested. Then he backed away, retreating to his corner like the act had cost him everything. Mason didn't react. He just exhaled, eyes closed, a tear slipping down his cheek. That night, Mason didn't sit outside Ghost's kennel. He sat inside it. With Tom's cautious permission and Zoe watching from the doorway, Mason opened the run, stepped inside, and sat down. The gate closed behind him. Ghost went rigid, his entire body trembling, his back pressed against the far wall. "I'm not here to take anything," Mason said softly. "Just to tell the truth." He spoke not like a trainer, not like a rescuer, but like a broken man speaking to another. And for the first time, Mason told it all: the guilt, the silence, the years of self-imposed punishment, the truth about Diesel, the truth about himself. Ghost didn't move, but his breathing slowed. His body relaxed. And when Mason finally fell silent, the shepherd crawled forward, step by trembling step, and rested his head on the man's boot. The next morning, something was different. Ghost wasn't waiting at the back of the kennel. He was at the front, sitting not perfectly, but close enough. His tail still, his ears relaxed, and when Mason approached with his stool and the day's liver packet, Ghost didn't lunge or growl. He just watched. Something had shifted overnight. The line had blurred between handler and hound, between past and present, between redemption and routine. Mason sat careful and slow. He didn't offer a command this time. He didn't need to. Ghost stepped forward. He sniffed the ground beside Mason's stool. Then, in a single, hesitant movement, he lay down on his side, his belly partially exposed. Not submission, trust. Mason didn't reach for him. Instead, he said quietly, "That's good, soldier. That's damn good." That afternoon, Tom called Mason into the office. Zoe was there too, a nervous energy in her posture. Something was wrong. David, the wounded animal control officer, had returned. He wasn't alone this time. He brought a clipboard. Official county orders. A 7-day euthanasia notice. Signed. Stamped. Legal. Public safety risk. He'd written, confirmed aggression, repeat offense, no rehabilitation. Mason read the paper without blinking. His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Tom looked exhausted. "There's nothing I can do, Mason. It's out of my hands, unless..." Zoe stood. Her voice shook. "Unless we prove Ghost can be transferred." Mason looked up. "What do you mean?" She pointed to a small paragraph in the document. "There's a clause. If the dog can be shown to be manageable for transport, that is, if he can wear a muzzle and walk on a leash without aggression from kennel to vehicle, we can transfer him to a sanctuary. There's one just outside Boulder, a facility for retired military working dogs." Mason looked from Zoe to Tom. "You can get him in." "I already made the call." Zoe nodded. "They're holding a spot, but we have to show video proof, and we have 6 days. 6 days. To do what many had said was impossible. Teach a deeply traumatized war dog who had spent weeks in feral panic how to accept touch, tolerate a muzzle, and walk calmly on a leash. Mason nodded once. "Then we start today." The following morning, the work began. Not with commands, not with dominance. With presence. Patience. Painstaking repetition. Mason brought a training muzzle, soft, padded, basket style. He didn't try to force it on. He didn't even try to touch Ghost. He simply set it inside the kennel, 3 feet from the dog, and sat. Ghost growled at it, snarled, trembled. But by the second hour, he crept toward it and sniffed. That was enough. The next day, the muzzle moved to 2 feet away. Then 1. Then touching the side of Mason's boot. By the end of day 3, Ghost allowed it to be near his face without panic. On day 4, Mason clipped a leash to his collar for the first time. Ghost flinched hard but didn't bite. He paced in tight circles, confused and trembling. But when Mason murmured, "Heel," something clicked. Ghost turned and stood beside him. Not perfectly, not proudly, but present, following. The 6th day came like a deadline painted in blood. David returned. Not to check in, to watch. Arms crossed, a pistol holstered at his side, a storm behind his eyes. He didn't believe in redemption, not for dogs, and certainly not for men like Mason. "You've got till noon tomorrow," he said, dropping the final order on Tom's desk. "That dog slips up once. I signed the paper myself." Zoe watched him leave, her fists clenched. He's not afraid of Ghost. He's afraid of what it means if Ghost can be saved. But Mason didn't respond. He didn't waste time on anger. He walked out into the yard, looked toward the kennel, and whispered, "Let's show them." That night, Mason stayed long after dark. No book, no stool, just a muzzle in one hand and a leash in the other. Ghost sat in front of him, panting lightly, gaze calm. Mason crouched. "Okay," he whispered, moment of truth. Slowly, carefully, he brought the muzzle to Ghost's snout. The dog tensed. Mason paused, easy. And then, like flipping a switch on an old generator, Ghost leaned forward and put his nose inside. Mason's breath caught. His fingers fumbled slightly as he clipped the strap. Then he stood. He tugged gently on the leash. Walk. And Ghost walked. 4 slow steps. Then stopped. Mason knelt, took the muzzle off, and ran a hand down the shepherd's back. "You just saved your own life, soldier." The sun rose on the 7th day. It came gently, casting long golden shadows across the gravel lot of the Pine Hollow County shelter. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a countdown. It felt like a beginning. Mason stood beside Ghost's kennel, a leash looped in one hand, the padded muzzle hanging from the other. He wasn't wearing his usual cap. The morning breeze ruffled his graying hair, and the lines on his face, etched by years of guilt and silence, looked softer somehow. Ghost sat patiently at the gate, tail still, ears relaxed. His posture wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. He was ready. Inside the office, Zoe held up the camera. Her hands trembled. "This is it," she whispered. Tom stood beside her, silent. Even he looked nervous, the kind of nervous that happens when everything depends on a single, fragile moment. Mason opened the kennel door. Ghost didn't move until he was asked. "Muzzle," Mason said gently. Ghost stepped forward, dipped his nose into the basket, and waited while Mason clipped the strap behind his ears. Then came the leash. Walk. And they walked. One step, then another. The gravel crunched beneath their feet. The wind picked up, tugging at Mason's jacket, but Ghost didn't pull, didn't lunge. He walked beside the man who, 7 days ago, had been just another stranger. Now, he was something else entirely. They made it to the transport van, the same vehicle Ghost had once thrashed against like a caged hurricane. Mason opened the door and gave a quiet command. "Up?" Ghost hesitated. Inside that vehicle were ghosts, screams, pain, but he looked at Mason and chose him over the memory. He jumped in. Zoe gasped. Behind her phone, her eyes welled with tears. Tom let out a long, slow breath. "We've got it." But Mason didn't celebrate. Instead, he rested his hand on Ghost's back, rubbing a slow, firm circle between the shepherd's shoulders. "You did good," he whispered. "Real good." Later that morning, Mason didn't go home. He stayed. There were forms to fill out, sure, transfer approvals, medical clearances, a final behavioral assessment. But more than that, there was something unfinished, something that had nothing to do with Ghost. It had to do with Mason. Zoe found him sitting outside on the edge of the loading dock, his hands folded in his lap. She offered him a coffee, but he waved it off. "Mason," she said gently, "he's safe now. You did it." He nodded. "Yeah." But she could tell something was still wrong. "What is it?" He was quiet for a long time. Then finally, in a voice low and broken, "I spent 15 years punishing myself for something that wasn't my fault." Zoe didn't speak. She waited. "I left the service after Diesel died," he continued. "Cut contact. Never called anyone. Not my unit. Not my family. Not my friend James, the one Diesel saved that day." He paused, staring out across the empty field beyond the fence. "I convinced myself I gave a bad command, that I sent my partner to his death, that if I had just waited or pulled him back, he'd still be alive." Zoe's voice was gentle. "But that's not what happened." Mason shook his head. "James told me the truth. A few nights ago, Diesel didn't follow my command. He disobeyed it. He lunged because James stepped into danger, and Diesel made the call. He took the blast to save his life." His voice cracked. "He was a hero, and I left. I let his legacy rot because I couldn't face the guilt." Zoe sat beside him, and now, Mason looked toward the kennel where Ghost had once lived. "Now I understand why I came down that mountain." That afternoon, Tom approached Mason with an offer. "You ever think about sticking around?" he asked, rubbing the back of his neck. "We've got more like him. Dogs nobody knows what to do with, and we sure as hell don't have anyone else like you." Mason looked at him, half a smile forming. "You want me to be a dog whisperer?" "I want you to do what you just did," Tom said. "Help them. Help us. We're full of broken animals, Mason, and not all of them have 4 legs." Mason didn't answer right away. But later that night, instead of driving up the mountain, he parked his truck beside the old caretaker's cottage at the edge of the shelter property. It was dusty. The roof sagged a bit, but the plumbing worked, and the view was peaceful. He stood on the porch as the stars came out, listening to the quiet. He didn't feel haunted anymore. He felt anchored. Behind him, Ghost, now lying on a soft blanket inside, let out a deep, contented sigh and rested his chin on Mason's boot. 2 soldiers, 2 survivors, no longer running. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, frost dusted the fence posts of the Pine Hollow shelter. The trees stood bare and motionless. The mountains, once Mason's refuge, now loomed not as walls of isolation, but as quiet witnesses to everything that had changed. The caretaker's cottage had come to life again. Smoke drifted softly from its chimney. A new gate had been welded shut. The old wood porch had been sanded, painted, and rebuilt by hand. It was nothing fancy, but it was home. Ghost, his once tattered coat now gleaming with health, lay sprawled across a fleece blanket on the porch, his head resting on his paws, one ear always tilted toward the cottage door. Inside, Mason was making coffee. He moved slower these days, not from age, but from something better, from peace. When Ghost let out a quiet huff, Mason glanced toward the window. A figure was walking up the gravel path toward the cottage. It was Zoe. She wore a thick scarf, her cheeks pink from the cold, a clipboard tucked under her arm, and something hopeful in her eyes. Mason met her at the door. "We got it," she said before he could ask. "The grant came through, from the Veterans Foundation, enough to start the pilot program." He blinked. "You're serious?" She smiled. "You're looking at the official director of the Second Leash Project. We pair retired working dogs with veterans struggling with PTSD, handlers, soldiers, anyone who's lost their way." Mason leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "And you want me to, what, supervise?" Zoe raised an eyebrow. "I want you to lead it." He exhaled, long and slow. Ghost had come to stand beside him now, pressed lightly against Mason's leg, a quiet, steady presence. Zoe continued, "You gave Ghost something nobody else could. You didn't just train him, you saw him, you met him where he was broken, terrified, lost, and you never asked him to be anything else but alive." Mason looked down at the shepherd beside him. "We saved each other," he said softly. 3 months later, the first veteran arrived. His name was Ryan, mid-30s, Marine, walked with a limp, spoke even less than Mason had in the beginning. Zoe paired him with a Belgian Malinois named Echo, a dog that had flunked out of narcotics work after an explosion in Kabul left him with severe anxiety and a tendency to bite his own tail during storms. Ryan sat for hours each day on the same stool Mason had once used. At first, he said nothing, just watched. Then, one morning, Mason walked past and heard Ryan whisper, "Stay strong, buddy." That same afternoon, Echo lay down for the first time. The program grew. 2 more veterans, then 5. Then a full waiting list. They didn't advertise. They didn't need to. Word got around of a quiet place at the edge of Pine Hollow, where a man and his dog helped people come back from the edge. Mason didn't talk much to the press, though a local journalist once did a story on him titled, "The Man Who Sat Still and Changed Everything." He didn't need recognition. He just needed to be useful, to stay grounded, to remember Diesel, and to keep the promise he made when Ghost rested his head on his boot, "I won't run anymore." One snowy evening, Mason stood in the yard as a new handler. A young woman named Elena coaxed a limping shepherd mix out of his kennel. The dog growled, skittish, untrusting. Mason didn't intervene. He just placed his hand on her shoulder as she started to doubt herself. "Don't train him," he said gently. "Earn him." Elena blinked. "That's how it works," he added. "With dogs like these, you don't break through with commands. You break through by staying." She nodded, sat back down on the stool. The dog watched her and didn't bark. Later that night, Mason sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. Ghost curled beside him, one paw draped over Mason's boot. Zoe joined him, 2 steaming mugs in hand. "Think you'll ever go back to the mountain?" she asked. Mason shook his head. "I did my time up there. That cabin was a punishment, not a home. This place, this is something else." "What is it?" she asked. He looked at the lit kennels, at the small cottage, at the veterans who now laughed in the clinic over coffee instead of shaking in silence. He looked at Ghost. "It's where we stop running," Mason said. where the broken stay until they're strong enough to walk again. He took a sip of the coffee. Besides, he added, I've got work to do tomorrow. There's a hound in the back that hasn't let anyone near him in weeks. He reminds me of someone I used to know. Ghost let out a soft, sleepy groan and nudged his shoulder. Mason smiled. Yeah, they were home now. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. The story of Mason and Ghost teaches us something powerful, that healing doesn't come from fixing the past, it comes from facing it. Both man and dog were broken in different ways, carrying scars no one else could see. But they found in each other not just comfort, not just companionship, they found understanding. Trust isn't built with commands, it's earned in silence, in presence, in staying when everyone else walks away. We all carry pain. Some of us run from it, others bury it, but sometimes the only way forward is to sit beside it, breathe with it, and wait patiently until it softens enough to let someone in. This wasn't just a rescue story, it was a return. A return to purpose, to courage, to hope. Because sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell. More stories like this are on the way. And if someone you love needs a reminder that healing is possible, share this with them. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.